Now let's talk about the different type of Linux shells that are available to us in our Linux environment. When we have a Linux machine running, what are the different shells that we could take advantage of? The first one is Genome. If you don't know what Genome is, actually, Genome is like a graphical environment that is in Linux. Now you must be thinking, isn't Linux command line interface? It is most of the time, but there are people who actually install Linux with the GUI. And the GUI, while you are installing the GUI or while you are going through the installation, you have the option to install GUI as well. And the two options that you have for GUI is Genome and the second one is KDE. Both of these are the desktop GUI environment and they are the shells. So you log into those environment, you are in the shell and then you run command. How do you execute commands? Execute through your keyboard and through your mouse. You click, 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 drag, drop here and there. That's how they interact with the operating system through that shell. Now, of course, let's go back to our main topic, which is the command line shells. Now, the command line shells, the main one is shell is just sh shell. Of course, this is we are now talking about when we do not have a GUI, we are in a command line, and now we need to use a shell. When user logs in, a user is given a shell, a platform to work. That platform is assigned to that user when the user account is created. So as I mentioned before, if you go to etc password, you will see your shell. So if you are, let's suppose, are given bash shell by default and you wanted to switch to sh, you could do that by going to a different shell. How can you do that? We'll cover that later. So shell, this just sh is a Bourne shell called sh or sh is one of the original Linux shells. It is developed by Unix computers by Stephen Bourne. His name was actually Bourne, that's why they picked the name Bourne shell. From he worked for AT&T Bell Labs in 1977. Those are one of the oldest days when actually Linux was or Unix was being developed. Its long history of use of means many software developers are familiar with it. It offers features such as input and output redirection, shell scripting with string, integer variables, and condition testing and looping, and so many other things. Which, of course, don't worry about it. All those the heavy words, we'll cover them later in the lessons. Then we have Bash. Bash, what is it? Now, the popularity of Shell, which was the SH, was so much that it made it actually motivated programmers who actually developed the original shell that was compatible with it. But with the several enhancement, they added so many things to it. Linux systems still offer shell scripts. They came up with Bash. So they still have shell, but now they came up bash. Now what bash means? It means born again shell. So the shell still exists. Don't worry. Don't think that shell sh is gone. Now the newer shell is available, which is called born again shell. And in our entire course, we will be using born again shell. Why? Because it has a lot of enhanced features and it is very user friendly. So many features or variables that we could use in that shell. Then there are other shells? There is C shell and TC shell. Developers have written large part of Linux operating systems in C and C++ languages, right? You know that. Using C syntax as a model, Bill Joy, who was at Berkeley University, developed the C shell in I believe 1977 or 78. Then Ken Greer, I think that was his last name, working at Mellon University, took C shell concept as a step forward. And when it took a step forward, what did he do? He came up with a newer shell, which was TC shell. And based on your system directory structure and files, T shell does not run bash scripts. So if you are in a T shell and you want to run bash, it's not going to run it. Anyway, most of the people don't use C shell and T shells unless you really are proficient in C and C++ programming language. So my advice to you, you could stay away from it if you are a beginner, not to worry about these. Then the last one we have is corn shell or K shell. David Corn. Okay, see, that's the name. See, that's why the people came up with these shells because they associated their name with it. So the person who came up with the corn shell, his name was David Corn. He developed this corn shell, and it was about the time like TC shell was introduced. So corn shell is compatible with shell and bash shell as well. Now corn shell improves on Bourne shell by adding floating point arithmetic, job control, and so many other things. I don't want to confuse you right now. In Unix environment, most of the time corn shell is used in Solaris. Whereas in Linux environment, most of the time a bash shell is used. As I mentioned again, if you need to know the list of shells that you have installed in your system, all you have to do is log into your Linux machine and type cat sc shells, and you will see all the list of shells. So this is what I wanted to cover, and I want you to be aware these are the different type of shells. If you are creating a shell script and you need to get help on creating a shell script, let's say if you Google it, maybe you will find some of the information or some of the scripting syntax in Bash and some of them in Corn Shell. So you have to be very careful. They're probably not going to work on one another. That's why you need to know the difference of different shells.